My name is Janet Miller. I am 65 years old, a retired nurse who spent most of her life caring for other people. I cared for patients, for neighbors, for my husband until the day cancer took him, and for my son Daniel, who I raised with both pride and sacrifice. I thought I had known every kind of storm life could bring, but nothing prepared me for the night I drove 12 hours through a snowstorm for my son's wedding. The highway stretched like an endless sheet of ice. Snow lashed at my windshield, my wipers groaned under the weight, and my knuckles stiffened on the steering wheel. Beside me on the passenger seat sat a small wooden box wrapped in a wool blanket. Inside was the lace tablecloth my mother had stitched by hand 70 years ago. 3 generations of women had touched that fabric. I wanted it to rest on Daniel's wedding table, a silent blessing, a reminder that love has a history. By the time I reached his new home, the storm had quieted, but the air was brittle cold. My breath fogged the air as I carried the box up the steps, my boots sinking into heavy drifts. I rehearsed the words I wanted to say, something simple, something a mother would say when she saw her only son on the biggest day of his life. I knocked. The door opened. Abigail, my son's bride, stood there in a silk robe, her hair pinned back, her smile thin as paper. She looked me over as if I were an unexpected delivery at the wrong address. Then she said it without hesitation, without shame. "Oh, sorry, we had it yesterday. Just family." Just family. Behind her, I heard glasses clinking. I heard laughter. I saw the flicker of candlelight from the dining room, and for one heartbeat, I thought she had misspoken. I thought Daniel would appear, rush forward and say, "Mom, you made it. We waited for you." But he didn't. He walked past the hallway, wearing his suit, his hair brushed neatly, his face lit by joy meant for someone else. His eyes caught mine for a second. Then he looked away. I stood on that doorstep with snow dripping down my coat and the wooden box in my arms, heavier by the second. Abigail leaned her shoulder against the door frame, smirking slightly, and added in a whisper only meant for me, "At least we didn't have to save you a seat." I felt the sting like a blade sliding under the ribs, yet I did not cry. I did not plead. I did what they never expected. I smiled, a small, steady smile. Then I turned, walked down the steps, and disappeared back into the snow. That night, in the silence of a rented motel room with the storm still raging outside, I whispered to myself, I drove 12 hours through a snowstorm for my son's wedding. His new wife stopped me at the door and said, "Sorry, we had it yesterday. Just family." I just smiled and left. Then I made one phone call. The next morning, he called me panicking, but I was too busy. I repeated those words to myself like a vow, because what I did after that moment would change everything. The snow had not defeated me. The closed door had not erased me. That night was not the end of my story. It was the beginning. If you have ever carried love across a storm only to find the door slammed shut, stay with me. This story is for you. You may see yourself in my silence, in my smile, and in the decision I made the next morning. And if any part of my journey stirs something in you, I hope you will share your thoughts when the time feels right. Sometimes your words are the lifeline another heart needs. The motel room smelled of damp carpet and stale coffee. The heater rattled in the corner, pushing out lukewarm air that never quite reached my bones. I set the wooden box on the small table by the window. My fingers hesitated on the latch, numb from cold, but it wasn't the storm outside that made them tremble. It was the weight of what I carried, and the question of whether opening it would comfort me or crush me. I slid the lid back. Inside lay the lace tablecloth, folded with care, its edges yellowed from age. I lifted it gently, running my fingertips across the delicate stitching my mother had worked by hand when she was barely 20. I remembered her voice. She used to say that every stitch held a prayer, a hope that her children would be loved and never left behind. The fabric still smelled faintly of cedar from the old chest it had lived in for decades. I pressed it to my face, breathing in memory, and felt the sting of tears I refused to let fall. Beneath the tablecloth rested a stack of papers, bound by a faded rubber band. I pulled them out slowly. They were loan documents, agreements Daniel had begged me to sign when he was younger, promising he would pay them back when life became easier. The numbers were large, too large for a single mother, but I never told him how hard it was for me. I simply worked extra shifts at the hospital, cut my own needs down to almost nothing, and paid interest in silence. I told myself a mother's job was to build a bridge strong enough for her child to cross. I laid the papers on the bedspread and sat down beside them. My eyes traced the bold print of Daniel's name, his shaky signature, alongside mine. How many times had I told myself that he would remember, that gratitude would bloom when he was older? And yet here I was, in a cheap motel after driving through a storm, shut out of his wedding with the words, "just family," echoing in my ears. My chest tightened, and a voice from the past broke through. Jonathan, my husband, sitting at the edge of our bed on the last night before his surgery. He had taken my hand, his face pale but steady. "Don't let anyone," he said softly, "decide your worth for you, not the hospital that treats you like a cog, not the neighbors who forget what you've done for them, not even the people you love most. Promise me that, Janet." I had promised, and somewhere along the way, I broke that promise. I let Daniel's needs, his demands, his dreams, decide what I was worth. I gave him money I didn't have, time I couldn't spare, energy that left me hollow. I gave him my future so he could build his. And tonight, when he closed the door, I realized what he had taken from me. I whispered it into the stillness of the room, each word tasting bitter and final. "I gave you a future. In return, you erased me from the present." I poured water from the motel kettle into the chipped mug on the nightstand. The steam rose, curling against my face, and I watched it as though it carried my life with it, always dissolving, always unseen. I set the mug down on the lace cloth. The contrast pierced me, fragile threads that had lasted 70 years and hot tea that cooled within minutes. What endured and what vanished seemed cruelly inverted. There were truths I had never spoken aloud. The time Daniel fell behind on rent and I sold my wedding band to cover it. The time his car was repossessed and I quietly withdrew from my retirement account to buy it back. He never knew, and I never told him. I thought silence was love. But silence, I learned tonight, could also be permission. Permission for him to forget me. Permission for Abigail to laugh at me. Permission for a closed door to define who I was. I folded the tablecloth again, slower this time, pressing each crease carefully. My mother's hands had sewn it. My hands had preserved it. Perhaps Daniel's hands would never touch it. I placed it back into the box, resting the papers on top like a verdict. The storm outside beat harder against the window. I pulled the thin motel blanket around my shoulders and stared at my reflection in the darkened glass. A tired woman, yes. A forgotten mother, perhaps, but not erased, not yet. My lips moved, shaping the words Jonathan had left me. "Do not let them decide your worth." I leaned back against the headboard and let the heater hum. My heart ached, but there was a new rhythm inside it, steady, deliberate, almost defiant. Something was shifting. Tomorrow would not be another day of silence. Tomorrow I would choose to speak, not with tears or shouts, but with action. The box sat beside me, closed now, but alive. It held history, debt, sacrifice, and resolve. And as I drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep, I realized that what I carried was no longer a burden. It was evidence. The motel phone sat on the nightstand, a dull beige receiver that looked like it hadn't rung in years. My cell phone was still buzzing with missed calls and unread messages from Daniel, but I turned it face down. I was not going to answer him, not tonight. Instead, I reached for the number I had written on the back of an old grocery receipt weeks ago, a number I had promised myself I would never use unless there was no other choice. I dialed slowly, each digit carrying the weight of years of hesitation. The line clicked once, then twice. A familiar voice, low and deliberate, came through. Eleanor Parker, speaking. I closed my eyes for a moment before I spoke. Eleanor, it's Janet. There was a pause, the kind of silence that holds recognition and concern all at once. Then her tone softened. Janet Miller. My God, I haven't heard from you in months. Are you all right? I almost said yes. I almost let habit lead me back into the polite lies of survival. But the storm outside, the ache inside, and the weight of the wooden box reminded me that tonight was different. No, Eleanor, I'm not all right, and I can't pretend anymore. Another pause, heavier this time. Then her voice sharpened, cutting through the distance. Kau im lang ju lao roy. Her words struck me with both rebuke and care. She'd always been that way, blunt but kind. I swallowed, my voice steadied. You're right, but this time silence will stand on my side. I'm ready to let the silence speak for me. She exhaled, slow and thoughtful. Tell me what happened. I told her everything, piece by piece, my voice low but unwavering. The 12 hours of snow, the lace tablecloth, the door that never opened, the words just family, the laughter behind it, and Daniel's eyes that refused to meet mine. I told her about the papers in the wooden box, the debts I had carried, the sacrifices never spoken. When I finished, the motel clock ticked past midnight. For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing. I could almost hear her thinking, sorting through law and friendship, through duty and compassion. Then she answered, Janet, what they did to you may not be a crime in the eyes of family, but it can be a crime in the eyes of the law. And even if it isn't, we can make the truth impossible to ignore. But you have to decide. Do you want to step into this fight? My hands trembled against the receiver. I looked at them, pale under the harsh motel lamp. Jonathan's voice echoed again. Do not let them decide your worth. Slowly, my fingers grew still. Yes, I whispered. I want to fight. Quietly, precisely. But I want to fight. By morning, I was sitting in Eleanor's office, a small brick building with blinds drawn against the gray winter light. The air smelled faintly of ink and old wood. Eleanor sat across from me, her silver hair pinned back, glasses perched low on her nose. She pulled a stack of folders onto the desk, her movements brisk, her eyes steady. Here's what we will do, she said, sliding a pen toward me. First, we secure your accounts. No more silent withdrawals or hidden signatures. Then we document every loan, every check, every sacrifice you made. We gather witnesses. We find records. We protect what is left and reclaim what was stolen, one step at a time. Her words were not loud, but they rang with authority. She opened the folder, clipped my papers neatly, and aligned them with practiced precision. Then she handed me the pen. Janet, this is a power of attorney revocation. It tells the world that your voice is your own again. Sign here. My hand hovered over the page. The letters on the paper blurred for a moment. I could feel the tremor in my wrist, the old habit of hesitating, of second-guessing, of yielding. I took a deep breath. My grip tightened. The line of the pen moved across the page, slow but deliberate. With each stroke, my hand grew steadier. Eleanor watched me. She didn't interrupt. She simply nodded as though she saw something settling inside me, something long overdue. When I finished, I set the pen down gently, and for the first time in years, my fingers did not shake. There, she said, gathering the papers, sliding them into a heavy binder with a sharp click of the rings. That was the first step, and you took it. I leaned back in the chair, exhausted but lighter, as if I had set down a weight I had carried too long. The heater in her office hummed softly. The blinds rattled against the wind. My eyes drifted to the wooden box resting at my feet. Inside was a tablecloth, a stack of debts, and the truth of who I had been for decades. Tonight, they had become something more. Evidence. Eleanor closed the binder and placed her hand gently over it. Janet, they think they erased you. But starting today, every word, every document, every silence you carry will become proof that you are still here. I nodded, my voice low but firm. Then let the proof speak. The morning after signing the papers, I woke in Eleanor's guest room, a small corner of her house she insisted I use until the roads cleared. Sunlight bled weakly through the blinds, pale and reluctant against the winter sky. I pulled the blanket closer around my shoulders and listened to the silence. It was not heavy the way silence had been at the wedding door. This was a quieter kind, steady, protective, almost like a shield. My phone lit up on the nightstand. At first it was one call, then another. Then the buzzing became relentless. Daniel's name flashed across the screen, followed by Abigail's. I didn't touch it. I let it vibrate against the wood until the sound merged with the thrum of my own heartbeat. I walked into Eleanor's kitchen, where a kettle waited on the stove. The house smelled faintly of lavender soap and cedar, the kind of scent that felt like memory rather than air. I filled the kettle and struck a match to light the burner. The hiss of flame was steady, calm, in direct contrast to the frantic buzzing from the next room. When the phone paused, it buzzed again, this time accompanied by a message notification. I turned the screen just long enough to see Daniel's words before setting it face down. "Mom, the bank froze the accounts. What did you do? You're ruining everything." I stood there, staring at the grain of Eleanor's wooden countertop, ruining everything. To him, everything meant his business plans, his new wife's ambitions, the projects they had tied to money that was never theirs to begin with. To me, everything meant a lifetime of work, of love, of memory. And he was right about one thing. The accounts were frozen. I had chosen to protect what was left. The kettle whistled. I lifted it carefully, pouring hot water over the tea bag in my favorite chipped mug. Steam curled upward, catching the morning light, and I wrapped both hands around the cup. The warmth seeped slowly into my fingers. Behind me, the phone buzzed again, louder this time, as if urgency could travel through walls. For a moment, I considered answering. I imagined Daniel's voice on the other end, angry but desperate, a child's panic hiding inside a man's tone. He would say, I didn't understand, that he was doing it all for the family, that Abigail had convinced him this was the only way. He would beg me to undo what I had signed, and for a flicker of a second, I felt the pull. He was my son, the boy I had carried in my arms, the boy who used to cry when his knees scraped on the pavement, the boy who once clutched my hand so tightly he left red marks. A mother does not forget those things. A mother does not stop feeling that reflex to answer when her child calls. But another voice rose inside me, one stronger than guilt, steadier than memory. Jonathan's words again, clear as if he were standing in the room. Do not let them decide your worth. If I picked up, I would hand Daniel the power to define me once more. If I stayed silent, I would teach him that my boundaries were not made of paper, they were made of stone. I carried the mug to the table, set it down, and sat in the stillness. The phone buzzed again from the counter. I reached over, flipped the switch to silent, and placed it face down without looking at the screen. The vibration continued for a while, rattling faintly against the wood, then slowed, then stopped. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with choice. My choice. For once I had not rushed to soothe, to save, to explain away. I had let the silence speak for me. I lifted the tea, sipped slowly, and let the heat travel down to my chest. The taste was bitter at first, then warm, then steady. much like the path I was stepping onto. The moral question hovered in the air like the steam above my cup. Should I forgive because he was my son? Should I bend because motherhood often means sacrifice without end? Or should I stand because even mothers are human and humans need boundaries to survive? I thought of the years I had worked double shifts, the years I had skipped doctor's appointments because Daniel needed tuition, the times I had sat in silence while he spoke of dreams funded by my sacrifices. Forgiveness had been my default. Tonight, it would not be. Tonight, my silence was not weakness. It was justice. The phone blinked one last time before the screen went dark. I stared at it for a long moment, then turned my gaze back to the lace tablecloth folded neatly in the wooden box at my feet. That fabric had survived 70 years, stitched with patience, guarded with care. It did not fray because storms came. It endured because it was strong. I whispered into the stillness, almost like a vow. I will endure too, but on my terms. The tea cooled. The phone stayed silent. And for the first time in decades, I felt a calm certainty settle inside me. The first shock had arrived. I had met it with silence. And silence, I discovered, could be the loudest answer of all. By late afternoon, the calls had slowed, but the silence was only temporary. I knew Daniel well enough to know he would not accept silence as an answer. And I was right. The knock came sharp against Eleanor's front door, 3 times in quick succession. The sound of a man who believed persistence was the same as power. I set down my teacup and walked slowly to the door. Through the glass panel, I saw him, my son, shoulders squared in a coat too thin for the cold, his jaw set in the same stubborn line he had since childhood. I opened the door just enough to stand between him and the warmth of the house. "Mom," he said, his voice low but edged with panic. "You are ruining everything." His eyes darted past me, as though he expected Eleanor to appear with explanations. "The accounts are frozen. The investors are asking questions. Abigail is furious. Do you realize what you've done?" I studied his face. He looked older than the boy I carried in memory, but in his eyes there was still a trace of that child, the one who always believed I would fix his mistakes. For a long time, I had. Not anymore. "You say I'm ruining everything," I said quietly. "But tell me, Daniel, what exactly is everything to you?" He shifted his weight. "It's the future, Mom. My future. Our family's future. You always told me to build something lasting, and that's what I'm trying to do. You can't just take that away." My lips pressed into a thin line. I reached to the side table near the door, where I had prepared a manila folder that morning. Inside was a copy of one of the first loans I had signed for him, more than 20 years ago. The numbers were circled in red ink. I handed it to him without a word. He looked down, confused at first, then defensive. "What is this supposed to mean?" "It means," I said steadily, "that the future you talk about has always been built on my silence, my savings, my sacrifices, and you never paid it back. Not in money, not in respect, not even in acknowledgement." He tried to hand the paper back, his fingers trembling slightly. "Mom, this isn't the same. That was years ago. Things are different now." I did not take the paper. I let him hold it, let it weigh in his hands the way it had weighed on me for decades. "Yes," I said, "things are different now, because I am different now." He blinked, caught off guard by the calm in my voice. "You don't understand," he said again, softer this time. "If you don't help me, I'll lose everything." "Daniel?" I whispered, leaning just close enough for my words to land like a blade. "You already lost something. You lost your seat at my table. You lost your place in the documents that carried your name. You had a seat at your wedding. I had none. Now you will have no seat in my trust, no place in my accounts. The space you denied me, I deny you." The words fell into the cold air between us. His eyes widened as though he had not believed I could ever be capable of saying them. For a moment, he looked like the boy who once stood on a soccer field, waiting for me to clap from the sidelines. But there was no applause here, only the sound of wind brushing against the doorframe. "You can't mean that," he said, his voice cracking. "You're my mother." I let out a breath, steady and final. "Exactly, and because I am your mother, I know what I gave you, and because I am your mother, I know when to stop giving." He stared at me, his mouth opening, then closing again. Words failed him. I stepped back slowly, my hand on the edge of the door. "There is no seat left for you here, Daniel. Not until you understand what that word means. Family." And with that, I closed the door. The sound was not loud, not a slam, but a firm click, a single note of finality. In that small sound, I felt decades of imbalance shift. I leaned against the wood for a moment, my heart racing but steadying with every breath. On the other side, I heard his footsteps retreating down the porch steps, each one slower than the last. Back at the table, my tea had cooled. I lifted the mug anyway, letting the bitterness sit on my tongue. There was no sweetness left in that moment, but there was clarity. The door was closed, just as it had been at his wedding. But this time, I was the one who closed it. And that made all the difference. 2 days after Daniel appeared at the door, Eleanor asked me to meet her at her office again. The air outside was brittle cold, the kind that burned the lungs with every inhale. I walked in with my scarf pulled high, clutching the wooden box like a talisman. She greeted me with a nod, her face composed but her eyes shadowed with something I did not yet understand. "Janet," she said softly, gesturing for me to sit. Her voice carried the weight of news carefully measured. She opened a thick folder, papers clipped and highlighted. I looked deeper into the property records. "There is something you need to see." I pulled my chair closer, bracing myself. She slid a copy of a deed across the desk. My name was there, but the signature scrawled beside it was not mine. The ink was clumsy, uneven. To anyone else, it might have passed. To me, it was a wound on paper. Eleanor tapped the line. "The cabin in the Catskills. It was transferred into an LLC last April. Your son and his wife are listed as managers. This signature, Janet, it was forged." The words blurred as my eyes fixed on the document. My hands tightened in my lap until my knuckles whitened. I whispered the truth aloud, more to myself than to her. They didn't just sell wood, they sold my memories, my summers, my life with Jonathan. Eleanor's voice steadied. "They used it as collateral. It may already be tied to a loan." I closed my eyes and the office dissolved. I was no longer in a chair across from Eleanor. I was standing in sunlight 30 years ago, the sound of cicadas humming in the thick summer air. Jonathan stood by the woodpile, swinging an axe with steady rhythm, the scent of pine rising with each strike. He turned to me, wiping sweat from his brow, and grinned. "This place will outlast us, Janet. That's the point." In the memory, Daniel was 8 years old, running barefoot across the grass, his laughter bouncing off the cabin walls. He had begged for marshmallows by the fire, sticky hands pulling at my sleeve until I relented. I could still hear the crackle of the flames, the chorus of frogs by the lake, the way Jonathan's arm wrapped around my shoulder as we watched our son chase fireflies. That cabin was not wood and nails. It was a vessel for us, for everything we had built when life was still wide and full of promise. And now, on paper, it had been stolen. Not by strangers, by my own blood. I opened my eyes. The tears did not fall. They hardened instead, freezing into something sharper. "He forged my name," I said, my voice low but steady. "My own son erased me so he could gamble with the only piece of home I had left." Eleanor leaned forward, her expression careful. "Janet, I need you to understand. This is serious. Fraud of this kind can be challenged, but it will take time, and it will be ugly." I nodded, though my body felt like stone. "Ugly has already happened," I whispered. "At least now it will have a witness." I picked up the copy of the deed, tracing the false signature with my finger. The curve of the J was wrong, too sharp. Jonathan used to tease me about the way my signature looped like ribbon. He said it was a mark of patience. Daniel knew that too. He had seen me sign papers countless times. He had copied me once as a child, giggling at how close he could make it. Now he had taken that memory and turned it into a weapon. The room felt colder than the snow outside. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to steady my hands. This was the pivot point, the moment where grief could drown me or harden me. I chose the latter. I looked at Eleanor and said, "We fight. Not because I care about the money, not because I need the land, but because some things are not for sale. They thought they could sign away walls and floors, but what they really signed was a confession. They showed me who they are." Her eyes softened, but her tone remained resolute. "Then we will show them who you are." I gathered the papers into the wooden box, setting them carefully beneath the lace tablecloth, symbols of memory and betrayal, resting together. As I closed the lid, I whispered once more, this time not in despair, but in defiance. They didn't just sell timber, they sold the place where my heart still lives, and I will not let that theft stand. I rose from the chair, my back straighter than when I had arrived. Outside, the wind whipped harshly, but inside me, something steadier had begun to rise. A fire, not of anger, but of resolve. The cabin had been forged away, on paper, but in truth, it still stood, waiting, holding every summer, every laugh, every promise Jonathan and I had made. And now, it would hold something else, the proof that I was done being erased. The next morning, I returned to Eleanor's office, this time with a folder clutched under my arm. Inside were scraps of my past I had gathered overnight, old bank statements, letters Jonathan and I had signed together, utility bills that carried my neat looping signature. Each page was a fragment of my life, and together they were the proof that my hand was not the one that had signed away the cabin. Eleanor spread the papers across her desk with the patience of a surgeon. She clipped them side by side with the forged deed. "Look here," she said, pointing at the curve of the J in my name. "Your line is soft, rounded, practiced. The forged one is rigid, almost rushed. Whoever did this knew the shape, but not the rhythm." I swallowed hard. Daniel knew the rhythm once. He used to copy my signature as a game. He laughed about how close he could get. Eleanor looked at me carefully. Then it wasn't a game anymore. It became a tool. She began drafting a timeline on yellow legal paper. April, the forged transfer. June, loan taken against the property. August, Abigail's restaurant project announced. November, delays and unpaid invoices. December, panic and the wedding rushed forward, perhaps to solidify appearances. As she wrote, I saw the pattern form, each date a piece of thread woven into a net that had been cast around me without my knowledge. At the center of that net was not Daniel, but Abigail. Her ambition was sharper than I had realized, her desire to build something grand overshadowing the truth of how fragile it all was. "She has vision," Eleanor said flatly, "but vision built on theft collapses. She thought if she leveraged your assets, no one would question her. A new wife, a new business, the image of family unity. But she feared failure more than she respected boundaries. That fear drove her to this." I stared at the forged deed again. Abigail's name was written neatly as manager, beside Daniel's. I tried to imagine the conversation between them, the moment they decided it was acceptable to erase me. Did Daniel hesitate? Did he look away while she guided the pen? Or did he convince himself it was harmless because, after all, I was too old to care? "I don't want revenge," I said finally. My voice was quiet, but it carried weight. I want to set a boundary. I want them to know there is a line they cannot cross, and if they cross it again, they will find me standing there. Eleanor nodded. Then we will build your case piece by piece. Affidavits from people who witnessed your signature, bank tellers, neighbors, anyone who has seen your hand. We will gather financial statements to show the years of support you gave. We will document every dollar that flowed from you to them. The law may be slow, but it leaves a record they cannot erase. I felt my shoulders square as she spoke. For too long, my posture had been bent under the weight of giving, of yielding, of believing silence was noble. Now, sitting across from Eleanor with papers scattered like stepping stones, I felt the first stirrings of power, not the loud kind that shouts or threatens, but the kind that builds quietly, brick by brick. As I gathered the papers into neat stacks, I thought about Abigail again, her polished smile, her carefully chosen words, the way she had leaned against the wedding doorway as if guarding a threshold that was never hers to guard. She was not a shallow villain. She was a woman terrified of falling, clawing at anything that could keep her dreams afloat. But fear is not an excuse for betrayal. Fear is a test, and she had failed it by using me as collateral. "Janet," Eleanor said firmly, breaking my thoughts, "from here on you must decide every step. No more signing in silence. No more letting others guide your pen. This case will not just reclaim your property, it will rewrite your place in the story." I pressed my hand against the folder of documents, feeling the raised texture of the ink beneath my palm. "Then let us begin," I said, "not to punish them, but to remind them that I am not invisible. I am the foundation, and the foundation decides which house still stands." The heater hummed in the corner. The clock ticked steadily, and for the first time in a long while, I did not feel like time was slipping away from me. Instead, I felt it gathering, aligning, waiting for me to step forward. Eleanor placed her pen back in its holder and closed the binder with a sharp snap. "We'll file the first motion this week. Once it's in the system, they cannot undo it. Your name will be there in ink, and no one will be able to sign it away again." I nodded, the weight of resolve settling into me like stone. The war was not over, but for the first time, the battleground felt level. I was not the woman shivering on the doorstep anymore. I was the woman sitting at the desk, holding the evidence, drawing the lines. And I knew this much: I would not cross those lines for them again. At night, two different houses carried two different kinds of silence. In Daniel and Abigail's new home, silence broke again and again with raised voices, the sound of slammed drawers, and the shuffle of papers pulled from folders. In my space, silence was unbroken, except for the gentle scrape of fabric under my hands and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. Eleanor had warned me that once the filings hit the system, their world would tilt. I imagined it as I sat at my kitchen table, the lace cloth spread gently across the wood, my fingers smoothing its frayed edges. I could see Abigail pacing under bright neon lights, phone pressed to her ear, calling contractors who demanded payments she could not make. I could see Daniel hunched over a laptop, scrolling through numbers that no longer aligned, searching for money that was locked behind signatures he no longer controlled. The more frantic their voices grew, the quieter mine became. I did not need to witness their unraveling to understand it. I could feel it in the space between my inhales and exhales, in the glow of a single candle flickering against the window pane. While they argued about deadlines and investors, I gathered my documents into tidy stacks, bank statements clipped together, letters placed in chronological order, every page a reminder that my life had substance, that it could not be signed away with a careless pen. The order of the papers soothed me, the way a nurse once found calm in preparing sterile instruments before surgery. I knew how to build quiet out of chaos. I folded the lace again, laying it carefully in the wooden box, then resting the folder of evidence on top. 2 anchors of my life, one made of fabric, the other of ink and paper. Both carried history, both carried weight. Somewhere across town, neon light hummed over Abigail's dream. A restaurant half-built, walls unfinished, invoices unpaid. She must have felt the ground shifting, the future she had promised Daniel crumbling under her feet. I could almost hear her voice, sharp with fear, saying, "Your mother is doing this to us. She wants us to fail." I wondered if Daniel defended me, or if he let her words plant deeper roots. Perhaps he told her I would give in. Perhaps he still believed I would pick up the phone and rescue them as I always had. He had not yet understood that silence was my answer. I lit another candle. The flame danced softly, casting warm shadows across the walls. In its glow, I saw not absence but presence. Jonathan's face in memory, his laughter by the woodpile, Daniel's small hand tugging mine in summers past. Memories were still mine, untouched. What they had forged on paper could not erase what was woven into me. And yet, a question rose quietly, as it always did. Should a mother cut her own child away? Should love yield to boundaries? I could almost hear the audience of my life asking it, the voices of neighbors, friends, strangers who would shake their heads and whisper, "Blood is blood." I answered them silently. Blood is not permission. Blood is not a key to open every door. Love, without respect, becomes a chain. And I was breaking that chain. I placed the last document into the folder, smoothed my hand over it, and blew gently toward the candle, watching the flame bend and then return, upright, steady again. Across town, I pictured neon light buzzing over Abigail's face as she tried to mask fear with fury. Papers scattered across their kitchen counter. Daniel's voice rising, cracking, breaking under pressure. In that house, silence was unbearable because it revealed failure. In mine, silence was sacred because it revealed strength. The contrast was stark. Their chaos, my calm. Their desperation, my resolve. As the night deepened, I carried the box and the folder into my bedroom, setting them on the dresser beside a photograph of Jonathan, his arm around me, both of us smiling in a snapshot taken decades earlier at the cabin. I traced the frame with my fingers and whispered, "I am not erasing him, and I am not erasing myself. They chose to erase me, but I will not choose the same mistake." The candle flickered once more before I pinched it out. Darkness wrapped the room, but it was not frightening. It was full, protective. A reminder that endings are only one side of beginnings. I lay down, the quiet steady in my chest. I knew somewhere Daniel and Abigail were still arguing, still clawing at collapsing walls, still blaming me. But here, in this room, I had already decided. I was not punishing them. I was defining myself. And sometimes the sharpest line a person can draw is not in ink or in words, but in silence that refuses to bend. The invitation came in a pale envelope slipped through my door, Abigail's handwriting precise and looping across the front. Inside was a single card, thick and cream-colored, embossed with their new address at the top. Beneath, in words polished but thin, was the offer. "Join us for dinner. Let us talk this through. We want peace." I held the card between my fingers, the paper heavier than its sincerity. Eleanor raised an eyebrow when I showed it to her. "They're afraid," she said. "Afraid of what the court will see. Afraid of what silence has already done." Still, I went. Not out of hope, but out of duty to myself. Some conversations need to be faced so that silence afterward holds its full weight. Their house was bright that night, every chandelier lit, the table stretched long and dressed in linen, plates of roasted lamb, silver cutlery polished to a shine, wine poured into crystal. It looked like wealth. It smelled like performance. I sat at the far end of the table, the lace cloth absent but heavy in my mind. Abigail welcomed me with a practiced smile, her emerald earrings catching the light. Daniel avoided my gaze, pouring wine with unnecessary care. The food was warm, but the air was cold. We began with pleasantries that tasted like ash, weather, neighbors, plans for spring. Then Abigail folded her hands and leaned forward, her voice steady and rehearsed. "Janet," she began, "we know things have gotten complicated. None of us want a courtroom battle. It's costly, exhausting. And really, family doesn't belong in court." Her word hung there, deliberate. Family. She continued, "We've discussed a solution. We could repay you in small installments, something symbolic. In exchange, you would withdraw the claim, and of course, the cabin would remain where it belongs, as family property." Her tone softened on the last phrase, as if the word itself could persuade me. I set down my fork, meeting her eyes directly. "Family property?" I repeated. "Tell me, Abigail, what kind of family locks a mother out of her own son's wedding? What kind of family tells her she has no seat, no place at the table?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking up, then down. Abigail's smile faltered but did not vanish. "It was a misunderstanding," she said quickly. "The wedding was small, rushed. We thought travel would be too much for you." I leaned forward, my voice calm but sharp. "You didn't think travel was too much when you forged my name on deeds. You didn't think of exhaustion when you emptied accounts I built with decades of labor. You thought only of what you could take, and now you call it family." The silence that followed was heavier than shouting. The clink of silver against china stopped. Even the candles seemed to flicker lower. Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came. Abigail pressed her lips together, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. I let the silence stretch, long and punishing, until it spoke louder than anything I could add. Then I rose from my chair slowly, smoothing the napkin and placing it neatly beside my untouched plate. My chair scraped lightly against the floor, the sound small but final. "I did not come here for repayment," I said, my tone even. "I came so you would know this truth. Family is not built on signatures stolen in the dark. Family is not built on closed doors and excuses. If you want to speak of family, look first at the seat you denied me." No one moved. The air was thick, each breath strained. I picked up my coat, draped it over my arm, and turned toward the hallway. Behind me, the silence deepened into a verdict. I did not slam the door as I left. I let it close softly, the click of the latch sharp as a gavel. Outside, the air was crisp, the stars sharp above the winter sky. My steps crunched across the frozen path, steady and unhurried. There was no triumph in my chest, no rage either, only clarity. They had offered me a seat tonight, but it was not mine. My place was not at their table anymore. As I walked into the night, I whispered the echo that had followed me since that storm. Just family. That is what they said. And tonight I finally understood. I was never part of theirs, and they are no longer part of mine. The silence of the road embraced me, and for once it felt like belonging. The morning after that cold dinner, winter light laid a hard gleam across my kitchen floor. The air outside was the kind of bright that only follows deep frost. I was rinsing a cup when a car door thudded outside, then footsteps on the porch. Before I reached the handle, Abigail's silhouette crossed the glass. She lifted a white envelope from the mat and held it up to the window as if weighing it. Through the clear sleeve, I saw the county seal. Beneath it, bold type, notice of investigation, temporary preservation order. She did not open it. She did not need to. Her face blanched as if the paper had drawn blood. Daniel stood one step behind her. His breath smoked in the cold. He reached for the envelope. His fingers shook, tapping the edge twice before he steadied them against the doorframe. I opened the door only enough to receive the letter. The green return address read, County Recorder and Clerk. The case number matched the one Eleanor had filed. Daniel tried a thin smile that never reached his eyes. "Mom, whatever this is, we can handle it together," he said. His voice slipped on the word together. I slid the envelope beneath my palm. "Together is a word you spent early," I answered. I stepped back, leaving them on the threshold, and carried the letter to the table. The kettle clicked off. Steam lifted like a veil. I broke the seal and read slowly. The recorder acknowledged receipt of my sworn statement. A lis pendens had been entered against the cabin. Any transfer, lien, or encumbrance was prohibited pending review. A hearing date would follow. Plain sentences, clean lines, the quiet machinery of law moving forward. Abigail hovered at the doorway. She craned, trying to catch a second read, her hands wrapped and unwrapped around her scarf. Daniel spoke first. "There's no need for this," he said, softer now. "It was a misunderstanding. We can unwind it." The word unwind felt obscene. People unwind cords. People do not unwind the roof over a mother's memories. I folded the letter and placed it on the wooden box that held my lace cloth, proof resting on history. I did not argue. I did not explain. I set the letter beneath the lid, reached for my coat, and slipped on my boots. Abigail cleared her throat. "If you insist on keeping the order," she said, "at least consider the optics. A public notice hurts all of us." I met her gaze. "A closed door hurt first," I said. Then I stepped past them into the sharp air. The door eased shut behind me with that same measured click, not a slam, a line. The snow in the front walk had crisped overnight. Each step answered with a clean, crystalline crack. I let the sound lead me down the block, away from their hissed debate on the porch, away from the tug to turn and parent a grown man. The light glittered off the drifts, the cold knifed my lungs. Inside my coat, heat gathered at my sternum like a small, stubborn sun. I listened to my feet. I counted the breaths. I kept the pace even. Show, do not tell. Let the crunch and the white and the air do the talking. Neighbors salted their stoops. A dog nosed the curb and sent up a flurry. The world kept its ordinary rhythm while mine reset. I remembered the night at the wedding door, my breath fogging, the box in my arms, the thin sentence, just family. The phrase had been a blade then. It was an echo now. It only reminded me who had stayed and who had left. A wind gust lifted loose snow and stung my cheeks. I closed my eyes and pictured the cabin porch, splinters in summer, Jonathan's laugh, Daniel's barefoot sprints through clover. The order did not resurrect those days. It protected the ground where they lived. By the time I turned back, the cold had sharpened my focus to a point. The house stood quiet. The porch was empty. Inside, the kitchen held its warmth the way a hand holds a promise. I set my boots by the mat, hung my coat, and lit a small candle. The flame tilted once, then steadied. On the table, the wooden box waited, the letter beneath the lid, the lace cloth folded beneath the letter, the present seated on the past supporting the present. Foundation, not shadow. The theme returned like a bass note you feel in your ribs. Power had slipped in this house for years, passed hand to hand through need and habit. Today, it came home and sat down. I brewed tea and let the bag steep until the water turned the color of oak. I did not rush it. I did not sweeten it. The first sip was bitter. The second warmed. The third settled. I opened a window an inch. Winter air slid along the sill. The candle flame did not waver. Outside, the snow kept its glitter. Inside, the room kept its heat. Cold without, warm within. That was the balance I intended to keep. When the cup was empty, I closed the window and set the box back on the shelf. I did not look for their car. I did not check my phone. The letter had spoken. The court would speak next. I would speak least. I touched the lid once and felt the grain under my fingertips. Then I let my hand fall, light and sure, as if laying a cornerstone. Eleanor called me 2 days later, her tone brisk but kind. "Janet, we need to prepare your sworn statement," she said. "You'll need to explain your history of support. Not every detail, but enough to show the court the pattern. Judges respond to context." I agreed to meet her that afternoon. I walked into her office with the same folder I had carried before, the papers neatly stacked, the timeline crisp. She spread them out again, her pen moving across legal pads as she asked questions. Dates of transfers, amounts of loans, years of payments. I answered each one carefully, but as she spoke, a weight began to stir deep in my chest. There was one story missing, one sacrifice I had buried so deep that even Eleanor, my oldest friend, did not know it. When she paused to sip her coffee, I spoke. My voice was quiet, almost unsure, as though I were telling a secret I had sworn to keep forever. "There's something else," I said. "Something I've never written down." Her eyes lifted, patient, waiting. "Years ago, when Daniel was 23, I began slowly. He came down with pneumonia. He was in college then, still clinging to dreams bigger than his means. The hospital bills piled up. Insurance covered part, but not enough. He didn't want to tell anyone. He was ashamed. I told him I would find a way." I looked down at my hands. The words felt fragile as they left me. That night, I went to the small jeweler on Main Street. I took off my wedding ring, the ring Jonathan had slipped onto my finger in a church crowded with lilacs, and I placed it on the counter. The jeweler hesitated. He knew me, knew what it meant. But he weighed it, wrote a receipt, and handed me a check. I walked out with bare fingers and enough money to cover Daniel's bills. The silence in the room thickened. Eleanor set her pen down, her brow softening. "I never told Jonathan," I whispered. "He was alive then, working overtime, already stretched thin. I didn't want him to feel like a failure. I never told Daniel either. I didn't want him to carry guilt, to think every time he looked at me that he had cost me something sacred. I thought silence was protection. I thought keeping it secret was love." My throat tightened. I let the memory linger, slowing the pace, forcing myself to relive each detail. The weight of the empty finger on my hand that night, the ache in my chest when I slipped the receipt into my purse, the way I told myself it was just metal, just a band, when I knew it was also years of vows and promises. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice gentle. "And you've carried that silence all this time?" "Yes," I said, because I was afraid Daniel would feel small, afraid Jonathan would feel blamed, afraid people would think I was keeping score. So I locked it away. I told myself my worth was in giving quietly, never asking for acknowledgement. I drew a long breath. But if I stay silent now, that sacrifice dies unnamed. And if it dies unnamed, it becomes nothing but air. I don't want repayment. I don't want pity. I want the truth to exist, finally, where someone can hear it. I want it recorded not for money, but for memory. For every nameless sacrifice women like me have made, tucked away in shadows, so no one feels uncomfortable. The tears burned but did not fall. My voice grew steadier as I continued. I gave up that ring because my son's life mattered more than any symbol on my hand. I chose love, even when it cost me something irreplaceable. And yet, years later, he closed the door on me. He said family was already gathered. He forged my name to take the one place Jonathan and I built together. I cannot undo what he did, but I can speak now, so the record carries my name, not erased, not silent, not invisible. Eleanor did not speak for a long moment. She reached across the desk and placed her hand over mine, firm and grounding. "Janet," she said, "that truth belongs in your statement. Not to shame him, but to restore you. The court may not weigh it in dollars, but it will weigh it in dignity." I nodded, a slow calm settling into my chest. For decades, I had let my sacrifices vanish like mist, pretending silence was strength. But silence without recognition is erasure. Today I chose differently. I am not asking for sympathy, I said finally. I am asking for acknowledgement. If my name is to be written in court documents, let it be written with the truth of who I have been. A woman who gave, who loved, who endured, and who will not vanish quietly. The candle on Eleanor's desk flickered as if punctuating my vow. I pressed my palm against the folder of evidence, then let my hand rest on my bare finger, where the ring had once been. It was gone from me, but the story of it was not. That story, at last, had a voice. 2 evenings after the county letter arrived, Daniel came alone. He did not knock like a man demanding answers. He tapped like someone hoping the past would open. I set aside the folder Eleanor had asked me to review and opened the door only as far as the chain would allow. Snow dusted his shoulders. His eyes were tired. "Mom," he said, voice low, "can we talk? Just us." He glanced toward the lamp and the wooden box. He looked smaller than his coat. I unhooked the chain and let him in, but I did not invite him deeper than the hall. The house smelled of lemon oil and tea. He stood with his hands in his pockets, as if hiding the same hands that had signed what was not his to sign. "I know you are angry," he began. "I know we handled things badly. Abby is scared. The project is slipping. The bank is calling. If you lift the order, if you help us renegotiate, I swear we will make it right over time." I studied him in the half-light. The boy I had raised flickered across the man's face. "You did not come to make it right," I said. "You came to make it easy." He flinched. "We are family. There is room for you at our table. We can start fresh." "At your wedding, there was no seat for me," I answered. "Tonight I am not keeping seats for anyone. I keep the house for myself." He swallowed hard. "It was one night." "It was a sentence," I said. "Just family. You taught me exactly where I stood." I stepped to the little table by the hall and opened a flat leather folder. I did not raise my voice. I let paper speak. "This is notice that your name has been removed as my agent, under power of attorney, filed and recorded. Here is confirmation that you are no longer a signer or beneficiary on any of my accounts. The bank's acknowledged receipt. This is the updated healthcare proxy and emergency contact list. Your number is not on it. This is the amendment to my living trust and will. You are removed." He looked from page to page as if reading a foreign language. His mouth opened and closed without sound. Finally, he found a thread. "You are choosing this," he whispered, not quite accusing, not quite pleading. "You are choosing against me." I felt the familiar ache rise, the pull of the years, sticky as honey. I remembered holding him feverish at 3 a.m. I remembered the day he learned to ride a bike. I remembered selling my ring to pay a bill so he would not drown in shame. Love pressed hard against my ribs. Habit reached for the old script. I set both down. "Yes," I said, "I am choosing. For once, I choose me." He stared as if the room had tilted. "What am I supposed to tell people?" "Tell them the truth," I answered. "Tell them you forged a mother's name and locked her out of her own history. Tell them you learned what a boundary feels like." He dragged a hand across his face. He tried again. "Abby is not a monster. She is terrified of failing." "I know she is human," I said. "Fear explains. It does not excuse. You had a choice. You chose her plan over my personhood." His eyes went to the wooden box. "Is the cloth in there?" "It is," I said. "It belongs to women who kept houses standing when storms came. Tonight, it belongs on my table." He nodded once. The motion looked like surrender and regret, stitched together with thread too thin to last. "If I apologize," he said, "will you undo any of it?" "I will not undo protection," I said. "I am open to repentance. It begins with truth, continues with repair, and ends with time. Paper can change back only after people do." The hall clock ticked. The heater sighed. We stood in a pause that felt like winter holding its breath. He stepped backward toward the door. At the threshold, he tried one last key. "You always said family first." "I did," I said, "and I am family. I am first to me now." I opened the door. Cold air moved over the floor and curled around our ankles. He hesitated, then stepped onto the porch. We did not hug. We did not raise voices. We let the night carry what words could not. "Good night, Daniel," I said. "Good night, Mom," he answered, the word frayed. I closed the door gently, the latch seated with a clean click, a line drawn without a tremor. The call came on a gray Wednesday afternoon. Eleanor's voice carried steady through the receiver, but beneath it, I caught a thread of triumph. "The recorder's office has issued the ruling," she said. "Pending full trial, the Catskills cabin is restored under your name. The forged transfer is frozen, unenforceable. For now, Janet, it's yours again." I let the words wash over me. I did not cheer. I did not weep. I only closed my eyes and exhaled as if a tight band had been cut from around my chest. "Thank you," I said simply. She answered, "Go see it." So I did. I packed a small bag, folded the lace cloth into the wooden box, slipped a teacup beside it, and drove north. The highway stretched long and pale, snow piled on its shoulders. Each mile felt like a layer of silence peeling away. By the time the Catskills rose against the winter sky, my breath had slowed to match their rhythm. The cabin stood where it always had, waiting. The porch boards groaned as my boots pressed into them. The key slid into the lock. The tumbler turned with a hesitant click, as though the door itself remembered my hand. I pushed it open and stepped inside. Dust motes spiraled through a shaft of sunlight that slanted across the wooden floor. The air smelled of pine and something older, the sweet ghost of summers long gone. I stood still, letting the scent settle into me, feeling it reach places deeper than bone. The silence inside was not hollow. It was layered. Firewood stacked in memory, Jonathan's laugh hidden in the beams, Daniel's boyish shouts echoing in corners. I walked to the table at the center of the room, its surface scarred by decades of use. My fingers traced the grooves, the scratches made by hot pans and careless elbows. Then I opened the wooden box. Gently, I lifted the lace cloth and spread it across the table. White against the dark wood, it seemed to glow. For years it had lived folded and hidden. Now it breathed again. From my bag, I took the teacup, porcelain thin and familiar, and placed it at the center of the cloth. I boiled water on the old stove, its whistle startling in the quiet, and poured slowly. Steam rose, curling into the rafters. I sat down, hands folded around the warmth, and let my eyes wander across the cabin. The hearth was cold, but I could almost hear the crackle of fire as it once was. I knelt, stacked kindling, and struck a match. The flame caught, small at first, then bolder, until the logs answered with a low, steady roar. Orange light danced across the walls, pulling shadows into motion. I listened to the fire's voice, the way it whispered and hissed, the way it stitched the room together. I sipped tea, slow and deliberate. The heat traveled down my throat, into my chest, into the place where grief had sat too long. My hands steadied around the cup. "They sold memory," I said aloud, my voice soft but sure. "But they never sold my heart. A heart cannot be signed away. It always finds its way home." The flames popped, as if answering. I leaned back and closed my eyes. In the crackle, I heard Jonathan splitting wood, the rhythm of his axe. In the whistle of the wind outside, I heard Daniel's laugh from long ago, when he still believed this cabin was treasure. The images did not pierce me now. They warmed. They lived here still, not as wounds, but as roots. I placed the cup back on the cloth and laid my hand flat against the wood table. It throbbed with life, as though it carried a pulse of its own. I matched my breathing to that rhythm, touching wood, hearing my own heart. Night drew down. I did not turn on every light. I let the fire hold the room. I pulled a chair close, wrapped myself in a blanket I found folded on the sofa, and watched the flames consume the logs. Sparks rose, died, and rose again. I thought of the letter Eleanor would draft, of the hearings yet to come. But here, in this room, the law had already spoken. I belonged. I whispered into the quiet, "Jonathan, it is still ours." And as I sat with tea cooling beside me and lace spread across the table, I understood. They could erase my name from papers, from invitations, from photographs, but they could not erase the sound of fire, the scent of pine, the steady beat of a woman's heart that had found its way back to itself. I left the cabin the next morning, the smell of wood smoke still clinging to my coat. The snow had softened overnight, turning the road down the mountain into a pale ribbon. My hands felt steady on the wheel, the kind of steadiness that only comes when your heart beats in rhythm with itself. About halfway home, I stopped at a small gas station off Route 28, the kind of place with 2 pumps, a flickering sign, and coffee that never quite tastes fresh. I pulled up, set the nozzle, and went inside to pay. Behind the counter was a woman maybe a few years younger than me, though the lines around her mouth carried the same story I'd seen in the mirror. Years of giving more than she received. Her name tag read Martha. Her gray hair was pulled back into a simple clip. Her hands bore the faint calluses of work. She rang up my total and asked if I wanted a receipt. Something in her voice made me pause, as if she had been carrying words all day and was waiting for someone safe enough to hear them. "Cold morning," I said, more to invite than to fill the silence. She gave a half smile. "Colder when you realize your paycheck's gone before it even clears. My kids, they borrow my card before I can use it myself. Say they'll pay me back. They don't." She laughed, but it was thin. I tell myself it's what mothers do, but sometimes I wonder if I'll ever buy something that's only mine again. Her words landed heavy. I saw my own past stretched in her outline, sacrifices made quietly, debts covered without receipt, love used like an endless well. For a moment, I almost told her to stand up, to draw a line. But then I remembered how advice can feel like accusation when spoken too sharply. Instead, I reached for something smaller, a shard of my own story. "I know what it is to give until you forget you have a self," I said gently. "For years, I thought silence was the proof of love. But recently, I chose differently. I chose to stand on my own side, not against anyone, just for me." Her eyes flicked up, startled, then softened, like someone recognizing a reflection. She didn't ask for details, and I didn't offer them. It was enough that the truth was spoken out loud. For a beat, neither of us moved. The hum of the cooler filled the space. She tapped the counter lightly, then whispered, "Maybe it's my turn. Maybe it's time I stand on my side, too." She smiled then, a small thing, but real. Not the tight grin of someone surviving, but the beginning of something else. Permission, perhaps. Permission she hadn't granted herself until she heard the echo in my words. I picked up my receipt, folded it once, and slipped it into my pocket. "It's never too late, Martha," I said quietly. "Never too late to remember you exist." As I walked back to my car, the air bit sharp against my cheeks, but it didn't feel harsh. It felt bracing, like breath before song. I slid behind the wheel and sat for a moment, watching Martha move behind the counter, her shoulders a little less stooped than before. I turned the key, the engine rumbled, and I pulled onto the road. My heart carried her words with me. Maybe it's my turn. It struck me then that healing is never just about one person. Sometimes the choice you make for yourself becomes a mirror, held up to strangers who never knew they were allowed to choose too. I hadn't set out to teach, to inspire, to guide. I had only chosen to speak one simple truth. I stood for me, and in that gas station, for one brief moment, the ripple began again. I came home on a Sunday evening, the sky already dimming into blue-gray. My house waited quietly, the the walls familiar, the floorboards groaning a little under my step. I carried the wooden box inside, set it on the kitchen table, and let the stillness hold me for a moment. It no longer felt like absence. It felt like presence, waiting to be claimed. I opened the box and unfolded the lace cloth once again. The fabric carried its faint scent of cedar and age, and I spread it carefully across the table, smoothing the edges so it lay flat. Then I lit a small candle in the center, watching its flame steady itself against the draft. After so many years of hiding, that lace finally belonged in the open again. I opened the window just a little. A winter breeze slipped through, sharp but refreshing, stirring the flame and my hair at once. The air carried with it the sound of distant branches bending, the creak of old wood, the pulse of a world that keeps moving no matter who tries to erase you. For a long moment I stood there with my hand resting on the table, feeling its solid weight beneath the cloth, listening to my breath. I whispered into the quiet, "I am the foundation, not the shadow. The foundation does not disappear. The foundation decides which house still stands." It was not anger that filled me then, not triumph either. It was something steadier, the knowledge that my life had always mattered, whether or not others wanted to see it. For years I had given and bent, believing that invisibility was the cost of love, but love that erases you is not love. Tonight I set the record differently. The candle flickered and cast a warm glow over the room. For once I did not imagine who was absent from the table. I thought only of what was present, a cloth that had carried generations, a flame that held its own against the cold, and a woman who had finally chosen herself. To anyone who might listen, I would say this: if you have ever been erased from the picture of your own family, you know the silence, you know the ache. But the question is always this: will you remain silent or will you act? I chose to act, not with rage, not with noise, but with clarity. And in that clarity, I discovered something close to peace. So I ask you now, if you've ever been pushed to the edge, what would you do? Would you stay quiet or would you step forward? Share your story. Someone tonight needs to read it to know they are not alone. And before we say goodbye, I would love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone with gratitude. If this story touched you, consider subscribing, not just to hear more voices like mine, but to join a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time here with me today. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this story with you. Remember, sometimes the miracle does not knock at your door. It waits quietly until your heart is ready to open. I looked once more at the flame, at the lace beneath it, at the night beyond the window. My chest felt lighter than it had in years. Then I whispered the words that sealed it all. Today I choose me.